Hi, everybody, and welcome to our conversation about parent partnerships and how vital that is for understanding the visual behaviors of your child with CVI. CVI is called cortical cerebral visual impairment. It's also called neurological visual impairment. It's a brain-based visual impairment that really impacts visual attention. And because of lack of visual attention, that reduces the ability for that visual brain to build a library of recognized items. So why is CVI so hard to understand by educators and the medical community? Is that the brain really was not very well understood till more recently, and there's a lot of work to do around that still. There's a wide spectrum of manifestations of CVI because every brain is different. We lack a real definition of that. It lacks medical tools for diagnosis, and many of you know this very intimately, that it's difficult for the doctor to see the CVI, to test the CVI, to determine the CVI. So it's really diagnosed through a series of visual behaviors, which we'll go through today. And it's also difficult to recognize because it can look like other more well-known conditions. So children are often misdiagnosed. So we think about vision in a very careful way. So we want to consider that vision is not only seeing, not only looking, but also interpreting and understanding what you see. That's what learning is. That's what vision really is. So what are those requirements for visual learning? What do we really need children to be able to do for that visual learning? So they certainly need to look using their central gaze. So your central gaze is what your eyes are pointing at, what you distinctly see the details of directly in front of you. You can see everything else in the periphery in a kind of blurred way, but it's that central vision that really gets the detail. So we need to have central vision use. We have to have central vision use that stays on an object long enough to understand what it is. And for a person with typical vision, that can be about 2 seconds for a new item. There's a lot that goes into that. It can also be that central gaze needs to not only look at one portion of that item or picture and shift the gaze to the multiple parts of that item or picture to gather the information about the whole. So that's shifting to the elements. They have to be able to, when you see something, link it back to your visual library of experiences that you've had in order to essentially attack this new item to try to determine what it is. So that vast amount of previous visual experience is important. And we're building this visual experience library from birth to just understand everything that's in our world. We want to also, now that we have linked that, is to begin to understand what we see. So the vision is a complex and very detailed process, not just looking. And this is critical. And this is the thing that's so hard for teams to understand, is that looking does not mean you understand what you see. So let's just look at what is accessible. So many children with CVI use their peripheral gaze. They're not using the central gaze so much. So they're using peripheral gaze. And if you did that, if you turned your head away from my screen and just left the screen there, I'm going to put something up there. You're going to really struggle with yourself to not look at what I'm showing you, but don't look. Just think about what you can perceive from what's on the screen. So if you turn away and I show you this picture, it's like, I see a little bit of shapes. I see maybe some browns, some grays, some black. I have no idea what's there. I don't really understand it. Color is the only thing that's accessible to me at this point if I'm not using my central vision. If I turn and look directly at this item, I very clearly see the details. I see all the different elements. I shift my gaze to the elements in order to understand what that is. So central gaze is really important. And if we know that children are using peripheral gaze, it's really important for us to understand how much color is important in instruction for children. With this peripheral activity, if we did it again, you can't even tell how many items are on the screen. So again, turning your head from the screen, leaving my screen in your peripheral view. If I show you this, you say, I see yellows, maybe a red, I don't know what it is, but I have access to color here. If you turn and look at it, you see fruit that are very close together. You could not tell that these were three pieces of fruit. Even if I gave you some separation, you'd struggle between telling me how many things were on this screen. We talked about shifting to elements and sustained gaze. So I'm going to show you a picture and I'm going to show it to you extremely quickly. I'm not going to allow you to sustain your gaze. I'm not going to allow you to shift to the elements, and let's see how much you get. So what did you see? Did you see any color? You might have seen some blue. You might have seen some people, maybe. You might have seen some things, maybe. But did you know what was happening? Did you understand what was happening? No, you couldn't. You didn't have sustained gaze long enough, and you didn't have the ability to shift to the elements. So let's look at what you missed. Here's a picture of, looks like maybe a grandmother at the beach. She's showing her grandson, looks like seaweed or something. You can see the little boy's facial expressions, the wonder on his face. You can see his clothes. You can see he's got a cartoon character on his shirt. Vast amounts of information that I'm gathering by my sustained gaze, but also my shifting to the elements of this picture. If I only looked at one portion of this picture, I would not be able to tell you what was going on in this picture. I have to shift to the elements of the picture. This is some work done by Yarbus in 1967 that took a look at eye gaze and how we all access pictures and faces and objects. So this picture on the left-hand side is a old-fashioned picture, and it looks like this woman is rising up from the chair to greet this man who's coming through the door. It looks like there is a maid that's holding the door. It looks like there's a couple of people sitting at the table. For me to process that picture, Yarbus would take a look at the eye gaze, and you see how that eye gaze flitted around to the different parts of that picture in order to understand what was going on. That shift of gaze, that gathering of elements is really essential. So in assessment, we want to take a look. Is there any shifting there? Because if that isn't, then that material really needs some understanding support by the child. They're not gathering it visually. Here's just some more work done on faces. And again, you see this tremendous shift of gaze that we do automatically. We do unconsciously, essentially, to gather understanding and recognize people around us. Now we have this visual library. We're looking long enough, we're sustaining gaze long enough, we're shifting our elements to the different portions, but now we have to link that somehow to our visual library. So I'll show you a picture. And what is this? With full visual libraries like you and I have, we can start to attack this item. We don't know what it is. We have no idea what it is. We never saw it before, but we have a vast amount of information in our brains about things like this. So you could say to yourself, kind of looks like a rolling pin. So maybe it's used in cooking. I see two handles to hold on to the edge of the edge. It's cylindrical, so I know it rolls. Maybe you have some exercise equipment that looks like that. So you say to yourself, maybe this is exercise equipment. I don't know what this is, but I can still begin to attack it. We attack it with the skills we have for visual recognition. So the other thing that we need to consider for kids with CVI is that there are very, very unique manifestations of kids with CVI. Every single child and every single parent helps me understand a new kind of manifestation of CVI. There's many, 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 many things that happen in the visual brain. That can happen based on where the damage or where the impact to the brain is. That can be a function of how that brain has rewired and learned with what it has. It can be based on what that visual experience that child has been presented with. That can make a difference. It can also be based on a child's language ability, their memory, their ability to predict. And if those centers of the brain are also impacted, children might struggle more to build that visual library if they lack language, for instance, if they lack prediction, for instance, and certainly visual memory you could see would be connected to a memory center of the brain. The essential partnerships with parents is just so clear because every tool for the accurate assessment of children with CVI relies heavily on parent or caregiver information. There is not one that doesn't depend on parent or caregiver information. Parents hold that vital information about their kids' visual skills, not only today, but across the day, across multiple kinds of environments, across their lifetime, which gives us some of that history of visual improvement that's very essential for us to understand. So at Perkins, we use three tools currently to take a look at children's visual skills. And what they really focus on, all three of those tools, is really on what's the level of visual attention? What's the child's ability to look? What impacts their ability to look? What supports it? What interrupts it? We want to understand what the child's visual recognition skills are, if any. We want to make sure we understand that from our assessment. And I think also we need to think beyond vision and think about their use of compensatory skills. They are using compensatory skills to understand their world, maybe better than they're using their visual skills. We have to understand that because that's our access point. Those compensatory skills can in fact support children's visual skills. We also have some really unique survival skills that kids develop completely on their own. Nobody told them about it. Nobody explained to them to do it, but I've seen it so many times. So if I put a complex tray down and put some items on a tray, I've seen kids bang the table. Not just one kid, but many kids will bang the table in order to get those items to jump, and then they know where they are on the tray. No one taught them that. It's really masterful. Other kids will tell us that they recognize people by the way that person swings their arms, for instance. That's not anything I had thought about before, but again, it's a survival skill. It's something that they developed to understand what's going on around them. Another mother told us that her child recognizes people by their shoes. And that's something no one ever taught this boy to do, but it works for him. And it's these, so we want to understand these survival skills. How are the kids coming up with this? What other survival skills do they have besides some of those ones that are more clear? When we gain information from you as parents, your answers are only as good as the questions we ask. So we really don't want to hand you an interview form and have you walk away with that interview form to fill it out, because we would miss so much of what you have to tell us about your child. So when we ask a question, we want to let you talk for a while. We want to let you tell us more and more about your child. The sentence itself, the question itself, is just a framer for information for you. So we're trying to be very careful in making sure that we ask all the right questions to get at everything that you know about your child. So at Perkins, we've taken these three tools and then we've combined them underneath these assessment areas. The first is appearance of the eye. The next is how the eye moves. We told you a little bit about shift of gaze before. Visual attention. Access to people. How do they know who's around them? Response interval. How long does it take them to look? How long does it take them to understand once they are looking? How do they use their vision with their upper limbs, their arms? How do they use their vision with their lower limbs, like their eye-foot coordination? How do they operate there? We want to look at sensory integration. How do they use their vision in the presence of sound or vibration? We want to look at visual field abilities. We want to look at the impact of motion, both from how motion helps gain visual attention, but also how motion disturbs visual attention and how children have difficulty understanding motion. A lot of things around motion. Visual curiosity is another area we look at. Visual curiosity is that ability to come into an environment and gather information without anybody teaching it to you. So it's very related to incidental learning. We want to take a look at how clutter and crowding impacts kids with CVI, what happens when more spacing is given between items, what happens when objects are arranged in a way that are more predictable for children. So that's an area that needs careful consideration. We want to look at form accessibility. What's the media that the child can use in order to understand learning? So this is a very important part of our understanding of the child's visual skills. We want to look at the impact of color for them, the impact of light for them, and their visual recognition. So when we think about the appearance of the eye, children with CVI often have eyes that are perfectly healthy looking because they don't have an ocular condition. So the eyes themselves look very good, but we will have a coexisting condition of nystagmus. I'm sorry, a coexisting condition of strabismus. So strabismus means that those eyes are not lined up with one another. And we talked about how important it is to be using that central gaze together. But most of the kids that we see with CVI have either an eye turn inward or an eye turn outward. It can depend on the task or the environment they're in, how they're using those eyes. They can uh, alternate, use one eye one time, one eye another time. We see that at times, alternating strabismus or alternating exotropia or esotropia, you'll hear the doctor say. You can also report to us that eye alignment might get worse, their eye turn might get worse depending on fatigue, whether they're ill, whether they're overwhelmed. And this strabismus tends to be one of those things that impacts kids at all levels of CVI. Also with the appearance of the eye and the issue of strabismus, you can give us a lot of information about treatments that have happened. Has your child had patching? Are there glasses recommended for this? Was there surgery? Did the child have surgery? You'll help us understand all of that. So this is a little girl who has perfect eye alignment. You can see her two blue eyes are pointed directly at us. They're looking directly at us. And you can see the little the little lighted reflection is appearing exactly the same in both of her eyes. That's how the doctor really tells that your eyes are perfectly aligned. And you can see that this little girl, that light's reflected in the exact same place in both eyes. Therefore, she has good eye alignment. When we think about the issue of movement of the eyes, sometimes children have a lot of difficulty controlling their eye movements. So they have these sort of roving eye movements, very different than the nystagmus. It's sort of roving eye movements, really linked to lack of fixation. They have difficulty again with that shift of gaze we found so important for visual learning. Maybe they shift gaze, but it's not smooth between one item and another item. So you could see that if we went back to Yarbus's picture, a jerky shift of gaze will not be as smooth and as effective in gathering information about a picture. Also, children could have less sustained gaze and shift to elements, whether it's a real item, you still need to shift to elements there, or a picture. Both require you to shift elements. And then some children with CVI do have nystagmus, so we want to take a look at that. When we take a look at the impact of color, one thing we look at is a history of preferred color. Do the parents report a favorite color? And one of the things about favorite color, nobody really knows why kids have a favorite color if they have it. Is it related to the materials that we presented to them? If all preschool toys are kind of bright, saturated colors, is it that visual brain got access to those bright, saturated colors, so therefore that's a better skill for them? It's not. This is an area of research that just hasn't been done. But we do hear this over and over again, a preferred color. The danger is that people see this preferred color and then start applying just that color to everything in the child's world. And what we've done then is really interrupt that child's ability to use color to recognize things. If everything is red, how are they going to sort items from one another if they're color coding, if everything in their world is red? So we should be very careful with this concept. That preferred color is not always red and yellow. We hear that all the time. It differs for every child. That's why it's on the assessment. It's different for every child. Color can also help children when there's clutter or when things are happening or are appearing at distance where things are visually harder. Color can really support kids. Kids can also need one solid color because the surface color holds the item together to look like one thing for them. So kids often will gravitate towards solid color items. We also know that color can, the color highlighting, if we want to point out a detail of an object or a detail on a picture, color highlighting can help draw attention to that. And we know that color coding can really be used as a great learning support and independent support for kids. So we try and tease that out in assessment. And color is very important at all severity levels of CVI. It does not disappear as a support for kids with CVI. So what do you tell us that helps us understand this? Well, first of all, when we ask you about favorite toys, we hear about particular colors. We hear sometimes that kids like bright colored books or that they like bright colors in general. We might hear about kids' TV shows that are bright colors. Maybe parents report if their child is searching for something, they say, it's the red thing over there. The parent feels like they have to tell the child the color to help them search, and they do this automatically. They also can see things like my child is searching for their blue car, but they pick up all the other blue things beforehand. So these are the kinds of, this is not an exhaustive list, obviously, but it's just a list of some of the things we definitely hear from parents. So in assessment, if we hear that color is very important, and we see that the child is struggling with this visual motor task, which is putting this piece of paper in a folder, just a little color highlighting on that slot that shows the child where to put the piece of paper can really help. And if we see that in assessment, we know color is very important for kids. Kids are using color for identification. So we might show this child this toy, which is a cartoon-like pig that's green with orange spots. And kids will look at this and have no idea what it is. And if I show them a real pig, they know what the pig is. And so I can point out the elements of this pig, and the child says, oh, but it's not the right color. Tells you a lot about how they're color coding the world. He could not, or this child particular that I'm thinking of, could not tell me what this was based on the visual features of it. He was relying heavily on color. When we take a look at motion, we want to know, does the child need motion to pay attention? Do I have to move something for them to look at it? Do they need shiny or reflective items to pay attention? Do they have a difficult time suppressing peripheral motion? So if they're in an environment, does motion around them just distract them? You can see they get an ADHD, or they'd be labeled distractible kids. Do they have a difficult time perceiving motion? That's knowing whether a car is moving or not, or whether an item is moving or not. Is that disturbed in this child with CVI? Do they find environmental motion distressing? So busy places, are those really hard for kids? Kids with CVI sometimes have difficulty understanding the speed of an item traveling, or the distance of an item traveling, or even the direction of the item traveling, which you could see we need to sort out because this greatly impacts the ability to cross a street, for instance. Do they display looming behavior? So if someone comes up too quickly to them, does that disturb them? Do they pull back from that? Do they start blinking rapidly to that? That would be what Gordon Dutton calls looming behavior. And this impact of motion impacts all severity levels of CVI. So how do you tell us this? Again, you might mention to us that your child likes all kinds of toys with motion. You might tell us that you have to shake it to get their attention. You might tell us that the child themselves likes to hold things and move it while looking at it, or that they like to watch their own hands in motion. You might tell us that the kid really hates crowded places, or can't see things that move too fast, or can't follow a ball, or when someone comes too close, they pull away. Or you might report that your child doesn't want to stay seated, that they want to be moving all the time. So we often think about that and wonder whether motion, their own motion, is allowing them to see better. When we take a look at light, we want to take a look at light sensitivities. Does the child have difficulty with light? Maybe perhaps doesn't like bright light? And these light sensitivities, we want to understand them in all environments. So parents might report that outside, the child really can't keep their eyes open because the light's so disturbing to them, but indoors, that's not a problem. So we want to know about light in all different kinds of environments when it's a sensitivity. Does your child stare at lights, whether it's overhead lights or lateral light sources like lamps in the room? Or do they look out windows and doors a lot? Again, you can imagine that in school that might be seen as distractibility, where in fact it's really just an attention to light. We want to know how backlighting might support visual attention, or how backlighting might support visual recognition. We'll really take a careful look at that in assessment, and really how backlighting might support visual fatigue. And this impact of lights across the board for all severity levels of CVI that they can happen. So you might, again, tell us about the toys, which if we're hearing about light a lot in the toys, sometimes parents will say they gravitate right towards the lighted elements of a toy, like the lighted button. Parents have told us their childs are obsessed with light. This light gazing might have been one of the first things that clued you when your baby was little that something wasn't right, because they weren't looking at your face, but they looked to the light. That sometimes that's one of the reported early behaviors that parents get most concerned about. Staring out the windows, as we said, children liking the lights off or on. Kids obsessed with light switches, that sort of thing. What's their history with light? Maybe they hate bright lights. Maybe they need sunglasses. Maybe children have a hard time coming from one lighted area into another kind of light. So coming from the outside inside, they kind of hesitate at the door and have to adjust a little while, or going from the inside to the outside, they have to stop and adjust a little bit. That transition between light can be difficult. You might also report how much your child likes iPads, computer screens, iPhone screens. All of that gives us a good indication or a good starting place when thinking about light for your child. When we think about response intervals, we're thinking about several things. We're thinking about how long does it take them to look? And then what's the delay from the time they're looking till it kicks off and they understand what they're looking at. We want to know how this delay changes in different environments. That would be what we want to know from you. And does this delay increase when the child is fatigued or overstimulated? And we see this response interval difficulty at all functioning levels of CVI. So you might tell us that I struggle to get their attention. There's the delay. Well, it takes them a while to figure it out. There's the delay. Well, in new place, they really struggle to find things. Another delay. Or they get tired at the end of the day, because the response interval is going to often change according to fatigue. And parents are really sometimes, and this is important information that parents will give us, they can tell us exactly when the kids are done with visual work. And it can be 12 o'clock, that they're done by 12 o'clock. Other parents will say by 10:30, they're just visually out of gas. So important information around response levels. When we think about visual fields, we're looking for information about visual field preferences that your child might have. And this can be very different from the clinical measurement that you might get at a low vision clinic. So in a low vision clinic, you're in a quieter environment with fewer people. And they test this with light. That's the source of information for them, is to test visual fields with light. But then outside of that, we see that children definitely have more attention in one field, have better recognition in one field functionally in the world. So when we think about visual field preferences, just please remember it can be beyond the clinical assessment that has happened. We see better visual recognitions in certain fields. So if I hold a spoon off on a good visual field, the child opens their mouth. But if I present it in a weaker visual field, they don't recognize it. So that can also be a preference, or it's a recognition preference, essentially. Children can have difficulty with using multiple visual fields at one time. So if I hold it up in this visual field, they can see it. They turn and look at it. I hold up in this visual field, they see it and they look at it. But when I present two, they only go to one side. They don't really have access to both sides. So that's something we want to take a look at. And again, we want to make sure that to check the lower visual field responses, even if it's clinically measured as full. If it's functionally difficult, we want to know that in the lower visual field. And when we get later on to visual guidance of lower limbs, there's a lot of crossover. We want to know how much that child is using their peripheral vision also. And we did an activity in the beginning where if you're only using peripheral vision or mostly using peripheral vision, color is going to be hugely important. If you're not using central vision, then we really can't be using photographs or flat images with you if you don't have that ability to see even how many things are on that page as you had in that peripheral activity. We want to know how visual fields might reduce when it gets when surrounded by clutter, motion, crowding, and noise. So many adults with CVI will tell us that in these kinds of environments, it's like looking through a straw, that the actual visual fields will reduce when there's too much clutter, complexity, motion, crowding, and noise. And again, this is going to impact all levels of children with CVI. So you might tell us about head tilts. You might tell us this is the best place I'm going to show the child. So in this case, maybe you tell me on the left near his eyes. Now I know it's the left's probably better, and it's probably better at eye level versus lower or higher in the visual fields. You might report your child misses food on the plate, or that they trip, or that you're really not comfortable with their traveling because you know curbs are going to be difficult for them. You might tell me that the child looks out the side at things, which would be that sort of layman's terms for peripheral vision use. Or you might report you don't really know where your child is looking. And that again would be, you know, your kid is not using their central vision very well. And so you're not sure exactly what they're looking at. When we think about the impact of clutter, crowding, and object arrangement, we're looking at whether or not your child is distressed by crowding and clutter, if they have less abilities in crowded places, if crowded presentations impact their visual attention. So if things are too cluttered, they just don't bother looking, and how much it really impacts their visual recognition. And how much does it impact finding you in a crowd? That's another area we take a look at. Background clutter becomes something that's very important, and that background clutter can really impact location and understanding, both in three-dimensional things like too many things on a desk, or two-dimensional things where it's too many things on the page. Difficulties with visual attention and visual recognition can also occur with closely spaced items. So if things are too close together, they can no longer sort one from another, they can't attend to it, or they can't recognize any longer. And this issue is a huge issue for kids with CVI, and it really impacts every level of severity. So you might tell us things like, when the child wants to find something, they empty out the toy box, they throw everything everywhere, or they wipe things off the table. They don't want a lot of things on the table. Or the child, when they're searching, has to pick things up out of that toy box and look at them one at a time in order to figure out what they were. Or when they pick them up, they space them apart from one another because they can't really see them if they're all jumbled. You might tell me that they hate busy places. You might tell me they can't find you when you go to pick them up at school. Or they like books with very few things on the pages. Or when they're counting, they might miscount things when things are too crowded, when they're just jumbled on the table. So in assessment, we'll test out whether or not children can look quicker, look longer, and understand better when things are presented individually versus in a crowded and cluttered presentation. When we think about object arrangement, can the child count these bears when they're jumbled on the table? Or does lining them up increase their ability to understand counting, which one has been counted already, and get them to be successful in counting those out of when we present it in an array that's predictable. For spacing, children with CVI might be able to identify this picture of an apple, for instance. But if I put three apples too close together, you can see the shape is very different than the original apple. It looks like a brand new thing. So spacing becomes very important. This would not be an image. If we're talking about apples, this would not be an image to present to children because it's too close together. It starts to look like a completely different thing when it's not spaced well. When we think of visual attention, we know children have difficulty with visual attention at every severity level. It can can be very environmentally based at times. It impacts children's sustained attention, and we talked about that you have to look at something for a certain length of time in order to understand it. Visual attention can be reduced in certain environments and can be reduced in certain fields. Visual attention can be very dependent on the color of something, whether it's lighted or not, or whether it's in motion, and typically this is slower motion that helps attention. It can be dependent on how far away something is. It can be dependent on whether it's in certain visual fields. It can be dependent, visual attention can be dependent on whether or not the item is familiar or not, or whether it appears in a familiar context. It can be dependent on whether there's backlighting. It can be dependent on if there's clutter and crowding of the background, if it's there long enough. So how long, what's the visual attention required for how long the material is presented to them? That can really impact visual attention and recognition. If the form is not presentable, and we'll talk more about form later, but if the learning media form is not accessible, that can impact visual attention. So an example would be a child might have visual attention to a real object, but not to any books. It can be dependent on whether or not the environment is predictable and quiet. And this visual attention difficulties impact all severity levels of CVI. So you might tell us, well, he doesn't really look at anything. I have to tell him to look. I have to shake it to get his attention. You see the crossover with motion with that question. He finds it on the right. So now you see a crossover with visual fields. He gets distracted. Well, he looks if there's light. He looks if he knows it. So that tells me that visual recognition is probably supporting the visual attention. She'll look if it's close. He doesn't look at pictures, he just turns the pages of the book. That's something we commonly hear. So if they're turning the pages of the book and they're not looking at the pictures on the page, they're really looking at the motion of that page. When we look at visual recognition, we know that children with CVI have, if they have limited visual attention, that is very much going to impact their visual recognition. You have to be able to look, shift your gaze to the elements, sustain gaze long enough in order for information to go in and build that visual library, and think of that visual recognition as a visual library. Visual recognition is based on memory. It's based on past repeated visual experiences. And this is very important when we think about literacy. You're not going to present a child with a literacy material that involves something that they don't have a past experience with, because it will be meaningless for them. If it's meaningless, they're not going to remember the story because it's meaningless to them. So we really want to make sure that literacy is based on recognition. Limited understanding of visual attributes really restricts child to just matching. So I can go anywhere in the world and you show me a container that holds water and I can identify it as a cup. I know I have cupness. I understand all the attributes of a cup. So I can do more than matching. I can reach into my visual library, pull up what I know about cups and apply it to any cup in the world. But some children, because of the limits of visual recognition, essentially are matching. They see their cup, they know their cup. It's match. It's not this broader understanding of the visual attributes of that cup. It's just matching one image with the real thing in their world. And because of this, children tend to begin to recognize items that appear all the time. So their own cups, their own spoons, their favorite toys. Those are the items that sort of foster that matching, that initial visual recognition, which is more matching. And children are really, so children, because of that, are really only able to recognize these highly familiar items that are presented in learning routines. They have difficulty with new materials and new environments. This is hard to recognize new things. They don't have those visual attack skills. It's hard in new environments where things are unpredictable. They might have a very difficult time traveling and remembering routes. Because of their difficulties with visual recognition, they're not processing landmarks, they're not recognizing landmarks in their environment in order to memorize the travel route that they need to take. We want to take a look at that. We want to take a look at visual recognition abilities based on form. So they may recognize something, they may recognize their cup in real life, but if I take a picture of their cup, that's meaningless for them. They're not able to do that recognition of that two-dimensional yet. Visual recognition can be very dependent on distance. just how far away it is due to clutter, or whether it appears where it's supposed to appear in the usual place, or is it out of context. And these recognition abilities is really sort of the core of CVI at all severity levels. So again, you tell us about their child's favorite toys. They go back to the same toys over and over again. Sometimes the children get the diagnosis of autism because they're sort of stuck on certain toys. Um, it's hard to buy a gift for a child because they know what they know, and you give them something new and I can't do that yet. So parents will often report that it's difficult to buy toys, new gifts for their child. Their parents can tell us whether or not a child recognizes something, because if you show it to them and they smile, that's recognition. If you show it to them and they don't smile, and then you turn the sound on and they smile, then you know that's recognition of sound that they have. So this is something we try to tease out with families. Maybe the child has language ability, traditional language ability, so can tell you what it is. That way you know it's recognized. Maybe when you ask them to get something, they grab the right thing, so you know that they recognize. And then also you tell us sort of about that history that kids have to have that same thing over and over again. When we take a look at form, we know that for some children, if something is too multicolored or too patterned, it's too complex for visual recognition. So they're not really looking at multicolored things very much. Or if they're looking at multicolored things, it's difficult for them to recognize them because it's the multicolors on the surface really break up the item and make them think they're looking at several things at once. You might report that there's better three-dimensional visual attention skills or visual recognition skills, or that children will really struggle with flat two-dimensional images. We also, when we think about form, and this comes from a lot of Matt Chejan's work around form, he has an image assessment that can be used with some children. So he can really help us sort out whether or not more realistic visual forms are better for kids. Remember that pig, which was very cartoon-like? If I had had a toy pig that was pink and looked like a real pig, that child might have a better ability to recognize it based on the fact that it was the right color and it looked more like real pigs. When I went too cartoony with that toy in 3 dimensions, he could not figure out what it was. Matt's image assessment takes a look at 2-dimensional images and takes a look at what form is most accessible. Does it need to have color? Does it need to be more realistic? What happens when it's cartoon-like or more symbolic? What happens when you present it in black and white? And so I encourage you to take a look at his work. He's got several webinars on Perkins e-learning that you can take a look about his image assessment. And form accessibility is an issue for all children with CVI. So maybe the child understands this real apple. Let's say this real apple is on the green background on the screen. He can understand maybe the child can understand the picture of the apple when I go flat, which would be the top middle picture. But now it's a drawing. The next picture over on the top right is a drawing of an apple, but it still looks an awful lot like the real apple. So you can see across the top, these are the sort of realistic forms that children with CVI sometimes have better luck with because they look more like those recognized things in their visual library. If we go to the bottom, you start to see more and more symbolic forms. We know enough about apples to look at the bottom left picture that's a color drawing of an apple and identify it as an apple. When it loses its color and it's drawn in a very realistic shape, maybe, what's the skill around that? We need to know that. And then when it goes highly symbolic and black and white, what's the skill with that? Unfortunately, most school materials are that highly symbolic cartoon-like images, which are often very, very inaccessible for kids with CVI. This is another thing where we think about that image matching. So maybe this duck visits my backyard all the time, and I know this duck really well, this white duck. But I can still visually understand when I see a baby duck that it's still a duck, Or if I see a multicolored duck, I still know that it's a duck because I have all those features in my head that make ducks ducks. I can identify this bathtub toy as a duck. I can understand the sign that has a silhouette of a duck and still identify it as a duck. I can look at this cartoon duck or a black and white duck, and I understand all those forms. We just want to make sure our kids are understanding all those forms. Looking does not mean understanding what you see. So how do you tell us about form accessibility? You might tell us that they look at toys but not pictures, that your favorite toys are one color. That would help us to understand how multicolored items maybe break up that recognition ability. Maybe your child can't point out things in pictures. Maybe they read print, which is more predictable, but they don't understand what the pictures mean. Maybe they understand real photographs, but not cartoons. Does your child always say, "What's that? What's going on?" This questioning that kids do is really one of their, again, one of the strategies I think they've developed to help figure out what's in the world, what's going on around them. So that questioning really needs to be seen in the light of them trying to get information, not them perseverating on something or them trying to annoy you. They're seeking information. Here's just different levels on a communication device for a student. So you can see they're very different in color to help this child with recognition. You can see there's from real photographs. All these items were highly, highly familiar to the child. And this red cartoon dog is just one of the favorites. But what happens if I switch out that cartoon dog and put something red there? That child still thinks it's the same thing because they're color coding by red. They don't have access to that real form, that cartoon form. When we do assessments, we think about sensory integration. What's the child's ability to use their other senses while they're looking? So can they look with familiar sounds and still maintain their visual attention? How about unfamiliar sounds and maintain their visual attention? How about when they're trying to hold their body in space, like when they're trying to use their walker to walk? Do you see less visual attention there? Do you see less visual attention when you're touching them or when they're being moved or when they're touching something? Or when they're feeling motion or vibration, do they tend to not use their vision so much? Do they have trouble maintaining visual attention? As I said, touching materials. And again, this sensory integration is a theme for all severity levels of CVI. But that's not to say that children with CVI don't need a multisensory learning methodology. But what they do need is to have each sense challenged at a time and each sense considered at a time, so that make sure they have visual access, auditory access, tactile access. So you might tell us things like, he likes to look more than listen. She likes to feel things more than looking. That your child has favorite toys that make sound only, not so much based on visual. Your child doesn't like too many people talking at the same time. They cover their ears. That you have a difficult time showing your child something in noisy places. They hate noisy places. That they like the sound off on the iPad, or that they seem to see better when they sit down, or they don't seem to be as visually attentive if you're touching them or you're trying to help them. So maybe helping them get dressed, they're not paying attention to, the sock when you're putting on the sock, or they don't look at the things they're playing with. When we think about access to people, we want to take a look at a child's difficulty with eye contact and difficulty looking even towards faces. They might not have a consistent social gaze, because if you're not looking at someone, shifting the gaze to the elements of someone's face, you're not gathering all that information, and therefore you're going to have difficulty with facial recognition or understanding of facial expressions, body postures. So all this is under access of people. They're going to rely on compensatory strategies for recognition of people. So you might report that your child only recognizes somebody by their voice or by the way they walk, when they hear the footsteps. They might rely on the fact that they know you at home, but then they can't really find you outside of the home because they know you're the only blonde person who lives in that house. They might use specific visual attributes. So the fact you wear glasses, or the fact that you have long dark hair, or that you wear a particular kind of clothing often, or that, all the way someone walks, as I already said, the swinging of the arm, or the boy who recognizes by shoes. How is that child recognizing you? And this can impact kids at all severity levels of CVI. So you might report your child doesn't look at faces, or they have this look through you gaze, which means that there's just not this social connection when you look at one another, even though they're looking towards your face. Maybe they understand who you are, but maybe they look right at you, but not so much at grandma, or not so much at someone who's less familiar. Maybe when you start talking to them, they have to look away from you. Maybe you tell me that you have to wave to help your child find you. Maybe they can't tell who's in the picture. Or if you practice that picture and over again, maybe they're coding you by that yellow shirt that you have on, and then they can identify you. But it's not really identifying you. It's figuring out, oh, mom's the one in the yellow shirt, so that must be mom. We've had parents tell us things like, my child runs up to every man in jeans, and the dad wears jeans all the time. So that child has developed this strategy that the man in jeans is my dad. And of course, right until they get up, they don't really know that it's not dad. Or you might mention to me that your child doesn't like you to wear a hat. So by wearing a hat, you take away some of that visual information for that child. Maybe they're coding by your hair color or your hair length. Parents have also reported that when they get a haircut, the child has a difficult time. So how is that child recognizing you? And is it visually alone, or is it these other little features that they are hanging their hats on in order to recognize you? So we really all look very much alike. I think this is a great visual to help us understand that. If I take away hair, I take away earrings, I take away glasses, I take away the beard, we all look very much alike, and we can sort these faces one from another, but a child with CVI, this is really the difficulty. Looking towards faces is very different than looking at faces. So just, if you look at this little girl who's on the left, she's kind of looking towards you, but that girl next to her has this social gaze. She's directly looking at you. She's accessing your face. And of course, you'd see a shift to the elements of my face if she were figuring out who I was. Visual curiosity is a really important area that we want to look at. We want to know whether or not a child can come into an environment and take in everything that's going on in that environment or not. Is it restricted when they come into an environment? Is it restricted to a particular visual field and they kind of ignore everything else in that space? Is it based on distance? Are they just kind of right here in their visual curiosity, or can they come in a room and really gather things around what's happening around them? So you can see that this is very linked to incidental learning. Visual curiosity means that they can gather visual information without anybody teaching it to them, without anybody explaining it to them. This is a critical piece, because they will have holes in their learning if they're not able to gather information from the whole scene, or not able to gather information at distance. They're going to need support. So if they can't look way across the room at the teacher who's getting on her coat, they're never going to know they're going to go to recess, which every other child in that classroom will get that visual information. So that child would need a calendar system throughout their day that would alert them to when things are going to happen, in what sequence they're going to happen. That would be a support that would help with that lack of incidental information they can gather. And we know that this visual curiosity difficulty really impacts all levels of CVI. So you might say, they don't really look around the room, they miss things, I can't point things out to them, they shut down in certain places, he won't look for a sound source. Something happens in the environment, you and I automatically look over at it. If they can't see that far away, they're not going to bother looking for the sound source. Or parents might say they're in their own world because they don't have this visual curiosity. When we take a look at the visual guidance of upper limbs, we look at what difficulties they might have using their eyes and hands together. Maybe they don't reach to anything because they really don't know items are there to be reached for. Um, Maybe they can locate an item, but then they turn away in order to look at it. Maybe they maintain their vision on an item while they're reaching, but they miss it. Maybe they use this strategy of not directly going for something very quickly, but coming in really slowly from the side or really slowly from the top in order to get that thing because they really don't know where that is in space so well. And that's a strategy they've developed. They might have difficulty placing one item on top of another or next to another. When they write, maybe all the letters appear on top of one another because they don't have that ability to space and put their writing tool where it should be in the right space related to the previous letter. And sometimes this visual guidance of upper limbs is really impacted by background clutter, how many things there are there, whether it's on backlighting or not, and whether the environment is properly adapted. And again, this can occur at every level of CVI. So you might tell us that they don't look while they're playing. So that's they're not using vision while they're using their hands. They knock things over. They don't put the cup on the table correctly. They're spilling all the time. They're looking away when reaching, or they're really careful when they reach. And so we might see a child that puts a cup on a table like this that's just going to fall right off. We also take a look if the child is writing, we ask them to write first, and here's Tom writing his name. And then we take a look at what's the impact if I just add a little color highlighting. Does that help Tom to put his pen in the right place? And in this case, it helped for the first assessment piece. This did help him. When we take a look at visual guidance of lower limbs, we want to know how they're using their eyes and their lower limbs. And this, again, very much crosses over with lower visual field issues. Sometimes we can't sort one from another. But they might lack attention to their lower limbs. They might have difficulty putting their foot or placing their foot correctly, like in the middle of a stair or in the middle of a stool. They can't really figure out how to do that. Maybe they can't put their foot into a shoe or a boot. That's hard for them. Maybe they have difficulty when they're walking across a room that has many things on the floor, putting their foot correctly to avoid that obstacle on the floor is another thing we take a look at. That can be impacted by how many things are on the floor, that difficulty knowing where to put your foot. It can be impacted by the object arrangement. You know, is there a pathway for them to follow? Will help them. The number of things in their environment and whether or not it's adapted. And this can, again, impact all severity levels of CVI. So in assessment, if we have a child that has a difficult time placing their foot on the stool correctly, if we just added a little color, a colored target, is that going to help? So that helps us understand the difficulty and also the support for that difficulty. So you might tell us that your child stops at floor changes in color because they don't really know whether that's a hole in the floor because it changed from a white floor to a black tile. Does that look like a step down or a hole? That child might stop at edges of carpets because they're not sure, is it safe for me to leave this carpet that's one visual element and get on to the next on the floor, which is a different visual element. You might report difficulties on stairs, difficulties looking while they put their shoes on, stopping at the thresholds, like a threshold of an elevator and being a little fearful to cross over that marker on the floor, or afraid of stepping off a curb. And so it makes you think about visual field difficulties might mean the child is totally unaware that there's a curb and falls right off it. Where when I think about lower limb use and this difficulty, it's when they're coming up to that curb, they know that's there and they're perceiving it differently. And that's where they're having trouble. So again, it's very related, but something that we take a look at. We take a look at, again, we want to know students' strengths. We know we're assessing their visual difficulties. There's no question about that. But we want to understand their strengths, their compensatory skills. And I'm using compensatory in a wider way here. How are they using their hearing, smell, their tactile exploration, or their proprioception to understand the world? Because that's working for them. We want to be able to still use it. We want to tap into that because the goal is learning. We want visual recognition to build, but the goal is learning, right? And we also want to understand what I consider to be the compensatory skills of memory. How are they using their memory to operate in the world? How are they using context? Are they only recognizing that the spoon when they're in the lunchroom with the bib on? How are they color coding? How are they predicting? How are they using that language engagement by asking you what something is? Or I remember this boy, every time someone came in the classroom, he would make a fresh comment like, oh, here comes trouble. And by saying that statement, that language engagement made the person who just walked into the room say something like, hey, Bill, that's not appropriate to call me that, or whatever. But Billy worked really hard and got you to talk to him, and now he knows who you are. So, these levels of compensatory skills to just really understand their visual world. So you might tell us again about the toys, and they like toys with textures or toys with sound. They might feel for toys rather than looking. You might tell me that they don't really look at the TV, they just listen. They feel for things rather than looking for them. You also might tell me that your child likes something in the same place all the time, which would be that prediction that children are really heavily relying on. So prediction is really important for kids with CVI. And it's actually important for all of us. If I go into a bathroom and tell me to find the toothbrush, I'm going to look on the counter for the toothbrush. I'm not going to look behind the toilet. I'm going to use less visual abilities because of prediction to find it where it's always kept. The fact that it's there allows me to find it quicker, allows me to find it more effectively, and to use less of my visual battery. So the more predictable we can make children's experiences in school and at home, the better they'll understand what they're looking at. So very often, and again, this is why we don't want to give parents any kind of an interview form to fill out, because your subtle responses tell us so much more about how CVI is impacting your child. It speaks volumes. So if I say, does your child like lighted toys? And immediately you say, oh, yes, they love lighted toys. That speed of response, that emphasis of response tells me that light is really important for your child potentially, if I'm hearing a history of that. If you give me a qualified response, which is like, well, yes, but only here, I get that not only an answer to the original question, but some other things that are impacting or other things that are supporting your child. That hesitation. And I always say to people at the beginning of an interview, please know that the questions I might ask you, when you don't have an answer to it, that's as important as having the answer to it, because that hesitation or that I'm not sure tells me a lot, tells me that perhaps this is not impacting your child as severely as other things might be. So really important, the subtle responses that you're giving me. So now what? First of all, if you are not engaged in a parent interview, during an assessment of your child, then the assessment is not complete. And I hope this presentation really helped you to understand this. When we do the interview, that frames the entire rest of the assessment. I know what I want to look at in familiar environments. I know what I want to look at in unfamiliar environments. I know what I want to talk to the school-based teams about. From your interview, I know from the interview and the observations and from the interview and observations, I know what I want to directly look at in my direct assessment. I know exactly what I need to know in that direct assessment. You also have to realize that this is this assessment that we would structure, this direct assessment, is a singular snapshot in time that we really need ongoing assessment. So this is ongoing assessment requires us to have well-educated parents around CVI, well-educated team members around CVI, because we need good reporting of this ongoing improvement, this ongoing difficulty in a certain area in order to keep assessing what might work. So creating strong goals and objectives around visual skills. And again, not on testing protocols. So you're not going to say, my child should look at blue things for 5 seconds. That's irrelevant. But recognizing their blue cup and reaching for it is a goal, could be a goal, because it's based in function, it's based in learning, it's based in something important for that child. So that ongoing assessment, and we want to be able to collect data on what's working and what's not working for your child, because every child is so different. There's essentially no intervention that covers every child. We have to try things. We have to know what we're trying, why we're trying, how long we're trying it, and whether or not that child is really having success or not. So this partnership is not just for this piece of assessment. It's for this ongoing assessment. It's for documentation of progress. It's to build our shared knowledge, your knowledge about CVI, my knowledge about your child, and to build some advocacy evidence for you, to begin to, you know what your child struggles with, what's the evidence of that, that you can help us have in a report, for instance. So I encourage you to take a look. We have a website, CVI Now, which contains a parent-only Facebook page, really terrific. There's some wonderful articles. So for example, parents know that their child struggles with visual fatigue. There's some articles about visual fatigue on that website, and some support articles, some research support articles. So the fact your child becomes visually fatigued is a real thing, and a real thing that school needs to think about, or that we need to think about in your home. There's lots of wonderful webinars that are on that site at this point, some great resources that are on that site. And again, as I said, some supportive research. So check out CVI Now. And just thank you so much for sharing your child with us.